Hey everyone, welcome back. So you guys have sent us a ton of stuff this week about tech news and business practices. Some wild stories, let me tell you. We're talking misleading claims about products, privacy concerns, even some pretty deep philosophical questions about wealth and power.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. But there's one story in particular that jumped out at me. It involves Tesla, self-driving cars, and a whole bunch of promises from Elon Musk that, well, haven't exactly panned out.
Right, and this case ended up in court, with a judge having to decide whether Tesla misled investors about its self-driving capabilities. The big legal question: corporate puffery.
Okay, corporate puffery. That sounds like a fancy way of saying exaggeration. Like, what's the legal difference between a company hyping up its product and straight up lying?
That's exactly what the judge had to figure out. And it gets tricky because we're talking about statements about the future. So how do you prove a company knew its predictions were false when they made them?
Right, because it's not like they were saying, our cars can fly right now. It was more like, they'll be flying any day now.
Exactly. And in Tesla's case, they relied heavily on this idea of corporate puffery as a defense. Basically, they argued that Elon Musk's statements about self-driving cars being right around the corner were just that puffery, exaggerated claims that no reasonable person would take literally.
Okay, but Musk wasn't just vaguely saying, self-driving cars are awesome, you guys. I mean, we're talking about some pretty specific statements here. Remember that whole Mother Frunker website he had?
Yeah.
He literally said, and I quote, "I really consider autonomous driving a solved problem. I think we are less than 2 years away from complete autonomy." And that was back in 2016.
It's easy to look back now and say, well, that didn't age well. But the legal question is whether those statements at the time were made in good faith or were deliberately misleading.
So where does the law draw the line between puffery and deception? Like, at what point does exaggeration become fraud?
That's the million-dollar question, and it often comes down to context. In the Tesla case, the judge ultimately decided that a reasonable investor wouldn't base their entire investment decision solely on those statements. They would have done their due diligence, looked at the technology, considered other factors.
Okay, that makes sense. But it seems like there's a lot of gray area there. Like, what about all those tech gadgets we see advertised with claims that seem too good to be true? Or even those video titles like, "The last PC building guide you'll ever need."
Right, and that's where consumer awareness comes in. We can't just blindly accept every claim a company makes, no matter how convincing the marketing might be.
It's like that old saying, if it sounds too good to be true.
It probably is.
Exactly. It really does make you wonder, with all this new technology coming out, how do we even keep up with what's okay and what's, maybe crossing a line? Speaking of which, this next topic is a big one: facial recognition technology.
Yeah, we've talked about legal gray areas, but facial recognition really pushes into some ethically murky territory.
It's one of those things that already feels like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie. Like, you walk down the street and suddenly your entire life story is on display for anyone with the right tech to see it.
And the capabilities are only increasing. We're already at a point where these systems can identify individuals in massive databases within seconds with incredible accuracy.
It's kind of mind-blowing, but also a little creepy, right? Like, remember that story we covered about those Harvard students who built those facial recognition glasses?
Oh yeah, that was a wild one.
I mean, on the one hand, it's incredible what they were able to accomplish using off-the-shelf components. But on the other hand, it's like, whoa, this technology is way more accessible than we realize.
Exactly. And that's where the ethical concerns really start to snowball. Because if something as powerful as facial recognition tech gets into the wrong hands, well, let's just say it's not a future I'm particularly excited about.
It feels like one of those slippery slope arguments. Like, we start with, hey, let's use this to catch criminals, which, okay, maybe that makes sense on the surface, but then where do we draw the line?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And we're already seeing examples of facial recognition being used in ways that should give us all pause. Law enforcement agencies using it with biased databases leading to wrongful arrests, the potential for it to stifle free speech if people are afraid to be identified at protests or rallies.
It's like, do we really want to live in a world where every move we make, every interaction we have is being tracked and analyzed? Where's the room for privacy, for anonymity, for just being a face in the crowd?
Those are conversations we need to be having now. Because this technology isn't going away, we need strong regulations, clear guidelines for use, and real accountability for when things go wrong.
And let's not forget about data security. We hear about data breaches all the time. Now imagine that happening with facial recognition data. It's a recipe for disaster.
It's a huge concern. And it speaks to the broader issue of needing greater transparency and oversight when it comes to how these powerful technologies are developed and deployed.
Okay, that's a lot of heavy stuff to think about. Maybe let's shift gears for a second and talk about something a little closer to home. We got a message from a listener who asked a really interesting question about, well, online shopping habits. Specifically, the ethics of taking advantage of generous return policies, especially with massive companies like Amazon.
Interesting. Tell me more.
It's something I've definitely wrestled with myself. Like, I'll order 3 different sizes, knowing I'll probably only keep one, maybe. But it feels different when it's a giant corporation, right?
Right. It's easy to feel like our individual choices don't really matter when we're dealing with a company as massive as Amazon. But that gets into some interesting ethical territory because on the one hand, those generous return policies, they're part of what makes these companies so appealing. We factor that in when we make a purchase.
Totally. Free shipping, free returns, it's all part of the deal.
Exactly. But then there's the flip side. Those free returns. They're not actually free for anyone. There's a cost associated with processing those returns, restocking items, dealing with waste. And ultimately, those costs get passed along somewhere, either to consumers in the form of higher prices or to workers in the form of lower wages or worse working conditions.
It's easy to forget about the real-world impact of our online shopping habits. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
And it's not about shaming anyone for taking advantage of a company's policies, but it's worth asking ourselves, where do we draw the line? Is it okay to buy a whole bunch of stuff, knowing we'll probably return most of it just because it's convenient?
That's a good question. And it makes me think about another aspect of this whole corporate responsibility issue, companies changing their policies after the fact. Like, remember that whole thing with Amazon increasing the price of their wing service?
Oh, yeah?
They built this whole ecosystem around affordable home security, got tons of people hooked on the convenience of it, and then bam, doubled the price of the monthly monitoring.
That's a classic bait and switch, isn't it? And it raises the question of how much we as consumers should be expected to anticipate those kinds of changes. Like, do we need to read every line of the terms of service, assuming we even understand the legal jargon, just to protect ourselves from getting burned?
It feels like a losing battle sometimes. And it goes back to that power imbalance we were talking about earlier. These massive companies, they have entire teams of lawyers and analysts figuring out how to maximize profits, often at the expense of consumers.
It's true. And it's not just about being savvy shoppers. It's about recognizing that we're operating within a system that often prioritizes corporate interests over individual well-being. It's about asking bigger questions about fairness, about responsibility, about the kind of world we want to create, both online and offline.
That's deep. And it kind of brings us full circle to those philosophical questions we were talking about at the beginning. The ethics of wealth, the role of corporations in society, individual versus collective responsibility.
Exactly. And these aren't easy questions to answer, but they're questions worth wrestling with, because ultimately the choices we make as consumers, as citizens, as human beings, they all add up to something. They shape the world around us.
So as cheesy as it sounds, maybe the real takeaway here is that we all have more power than we realize.
Absolutely. Our choices matter.
Yeah.
Our voices matter. And the more we engage with these issues, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the complexities of this increasingly digital, interconnected world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today, but keep those conversations going, folks. Talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors. Share your thoughts, your concerns, your hopes for the future. Because the more we talk about these things, the more likely we are to find solutions that work for everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.